The Cinema Specialist Phil and John are back, and today we continue our top 10 series, and we're discussing the 10 best Ridley Scott movies. John and I are both, I think, very excited for Gladiator 2 to come out. I actually just bought my tickets literally 25 minutes before this. I'm going Saturday night. I'm going to brave a movie theater in Florida on a Saturday night to see a movie. I'm going to hope that audiences can keep themselves together for at least 2.5 hours, I think. Ugh. Yikes. I probably am expecting too much from audiences. But John, I'm excited for Gladiator 2. Are you excited for Gladiator 2?
I have been excited for Gladiator 2 for a while, and then I watched almost all of Ridley Scott's filmography over the last 2 weeks. And now I'm just hoping it lands on the right side of the... And that's all I'll say.
It's funny. You're so much more dedicated to this stuff than I am. I pretty much said, oh, wow, I've never seen Matchstick Men. I better watch that one. And then everything else I'm doing based off of memory, man. Like I'm just going based off memory. I will say this, though. What's very interesting with Ridley Scott, out of all of the iconic directors, because he is an iconic director, like there is no denying that. But out of all of the iconic directors out there, I don't know if there is somebody more inconsistent in the history of film. He has some of the highest highs, and he has some of the lowest lows. And he also has some of the most mediocre movies you will ever see. And it's all so fascinating to me because even Gladiator. So, and you know, obviously I love Gladiator. You love Gladiator. We're going to be talking about Gladiator soon. But even a movie like Gladiator, I've always loved when Rotten Tomatoes does their here's every best picture movie ranked by nonsensical critics who don't understand life. And so they put it out there, and Gladiator is always like near the bottom because I think it only has like a 78% or something like that in Rotten Tomatoes. Even that movie couldn't receive universal acclaim from critics because there's just something about Ridley Scott's style. Now, granted, I always say with Rotten Tomatoes, it's a cesspool. I don't like it. It's dumb. But if they want to sponsor the podcast, no, I'm just kidding. But I just think that's very interesting when it comes to Ridley Scott movies. I don't know, and I could be wrong on this, but I don't think Ridley Scott has a movie over 90% on Rotten Tomatoes. And I'm going to look that up right now.
Well, I think the other thing to consider when it comes to Ridley Scott is I don't know a single director who has more general praise for the sheer amount of director's cuts as Ridley Scott does. And I think that's one of the interesting things when considering just Ridley Scott in general as a director. Like, he can make these long spawning films that and these massive epics, but when told to cut it down to a reasonable length for general theater-going audiences, he gets such a mixed response to all of his films. We discussed Napoleon when it came out. And there's been rumbling since that movie came out of the 4-hour director's cut of that movie. I was like, Ridley Scott, just make a theatrical release that, tells what you want to tell and gives us a complete story. But I guess Ridley Scott just can't be contained within these general confines of the theatrical release. And it's really interesting because we had this conversation when we came up with this topic. It's like, okay, we're going to contain ourselves to just theatrical cuts. Because we needed that consistency in how we were grading these. And having gone through a lot of Ridley Scott movies in the last couple of weeks, it's hard to find the theatrical cuts of some of these movies.
Well, what's funny, so I just went through his entire filmography over here on Rotten Tomatoes. 2 movies have over a 90% that are the original, like that are the theatrical versions. Alien and The Martian. Blade Runner has an 89%. Blade Runner, the final cut, has 94%. So it's just like, I don't know. I'm not a big fan. Like, look, I'll always watch a director's cut, right? Like, if I like the movie enough, I'll sit down and I'll watch it. But I'm not a big fan. This is why, and I don't have Blade Runner on my list, and I don't care. Like, I think Blade Runner is the most overrated movie of all time. So if you think that that's the stupidest statement ever, you should probably stop listening to the podcast. But John does have it. You do have Blade Runner in your top 10, right?
I do. It's not high in my top 10, but it did make the list.
So we will be talking Blade Runner at least a little bit. But what drove me nuts with Blade Runner was I went to Blockbuster. I rented Blade Runner. I watched Blade Runner. I was so underwhelmed. Okay. And this, John, we talked about AFI lists last week with musicals, right? This was because of the 2007 AFI list. 2007 AFI list had Blade Runner on there, Harrison Ford, Ridley Scott, all this shit. So my dad and I were like, let's watch Blade Runner. Totally underwhelmed. So then I get to college and it's all about, oh, well, you just watched the wrong version. You got to watch this version. Okay. I watch whatever version they tell me to. I'm completely underwhelmed. Oh, well, the best one is actually the final cut. Okay. Let me watch final cut. Totally underwhelmed. And it's like, the thing is, if you don't like one version of a movie, you're probably not going to like the others either. Heaven's Gate is a massive rarity. Heaven's Gate was a movie that was going to be 3.5 hours long. They tried to cut it down to like 2 hours for a theatrical version. This is Michael Cimino. This isn't Ridley Scott. But it's like they butchered it. It almost bankrupts United Artists. Nobody sees it. Now Criterion puts it out and it's a beautiful, great movie. That's very rare. If you love a movie, sure, go watch as many versions of Apocalypse Now as you can. Although the original theatrical cut is the best version of Apocalypse Now, as is the case with most movies. The theatrical version is generally the best version of that movie. But with Ridley Scott fans, it tends to always be, no, the director's cut is better. And is that because the director's cut is actually that good? Or is it just because you like the theatrical version and you're happy that they expanded on it for the director's cut? Because to me, Blade Runner is a great 2 hour to 2.5 hour nap, no matter which version you're watching. So, we'll get into that. I can't wait. But there are, like I said, though, Ridley Scott has 5 4-star movies, in my opinion, 2 3.5-star movies, 2 3-star movies, and then everything else is just a mosh. It's just like whatever. So I'm excited to dive into this list and get ready. And I can't believe my number 10 is my number 10. So,
I'm pretty sure my number 10 is going to surprise some people too. So
you want to surprise people first? I think I surprised people first last time. So go ahead.
Okay.
What do you got?
My number 10 Ridley Scott movie is probably one of his most acclaimed movies. It's The Martian. And a lot of it comes down to the fact that, and I think The Martian, is this perfect encapsulation of what Ridley Scott movies are. I watched it. I gave it 2.5 stars. So it is on the lower side. It's still clearly like in the top 10 of his 30 films, but it lacks the substance. And that's what I find when I dislike a Ridley Scott movie. I find it lacks substance. Raptor is here chiming in saying that the Kingdom of Heaven director's cut is great, but the theatrical cut is meh. I 100% agree, Raptor, and it's because of the same reason that I find with The Martian. There's so little substance in these films. There is such an interesting aspect to discuss in The Martian of the survivalism of Matt Damon's character in that movie and these aspects. And it focuses, for some reason, Ridley Scott decides to focus on all the most boring possible parts of this story and doesn't build up the characters in a way where you really care about anything. There's never a point where you are actually concerned Matt Damon isn't going to survive. And for a movie like this, I feel like that's really necessary.
I do have The Martian on my list, not much higher. What's funny about the timing of The Martian is it came out the year. Am I frozen? No, okay, I'm here.
Nope.
It came out the year after Interstellar. I think that's a very interesting timing because with Interstellar didn't get nominated for Best Picture or anything like that. And there was a pretty large outcry over that in 2014. 2014 was a pretty solid year, but people wanted Nolan to get that love. And then the next year, Ridley Scott comes out with a movie, star-studded cast. He's directing. He's never won an Oscar for Best Director. And he puts out a science fiction movie that it's based on a very popular novel. And it's like, wow, we can have that science fiction movie that we blew off last year. So it gets all this acclaim. And to me, The Martian's a good movie. It's not a great movie. It's not an Oscar-worthy movie, but it's a good movie. I was entertained by it. But I'm one of those people who, when people start blowing things out of proportion, that drives me crazy, right? That always makes me, shy away from movies. And The Martian was one of those where people loved it so much and acted like it was this masterpiece, out of control, great. And I was like, it's good. Let's chill. But if you keep saying it's great, it's going to very quickly become bad. So please stop doing that. And I will say that now, 9 full years later, the hype around The Martian has totally died off. So we're not really worried about that anymore. But I do have that on my list. I want to say my 10. And this is strictly because where was I going to go with my 10? If I'm not going to put Blade Runner on here, this is a 2.5-star movie. Maybe it's recency bias because it's probably one of the most recent movies I've seen from Ridley Scott. when you start getting into the mush, and I'm gonna when I say the
Mhm.
mush, this is what I mean by the mush. I mean Body of Lies. I mean A Good Year, which is actually terrible. I mean Kingdom of Heaven, any version that isn't the director's cut. And we're only doing original cuts. I mean Hannibal. I mean all the money in the world. Like the mush, the 2 to 2.5 star movies. This is probably the most entertaining one. So I'm saying Napoleon. I can't believe it.
Sure. I
I can't
mean,
believe it.
we covered it for an episode of the podcast, and it's kind of, I felt it when I saw, I think it was when I rewatched, no, it's when I rewatched Kingdom of Heaven in anticipation for this. Napoleon is like the spectacle of Kingdom of Heaven, but with a much better actor leading the cast.
Yes, but also still a paper thin story. Like the
Yeah.
story for Napoleon is nonsense. There's nothing going on. There's nothing between the ears of Napoleon. But I mean it's good, and you sit down and you watch Napoleon and all I could think the entire time watching Napoleon is what could have been. And that's what I'm worried about with Gladiator too, right? Like I'm a little worried, am I going to be sitting there going, "Oh man, if he would have just done this, if he would have just done this, if he would have just done this." And like I know you gave it 1.5 stars, by no means that I loved this movie. Like that's not what I'm saying. But the Battle of Waterloo, great. That's enough to literally land it in this top 10. And I'm going to talk a lot about his direction of action. When we get to a movie that you and I disagree heavily on, which is Black Hawk Down. But when we get to that movie, like his direction of action is phenomenal. So I go Napoleon at 10. And I think just for the Battle of Waterloo, it's a paper thin story. But you know what? Sometimes like give me simplistic. And I think Napoleon might be the most accurate depiction of what Ridley Scott's career is, which is can do spectacle like nobody else, but at what cost?
Yeah, and again, like this is a movie that has been rumored to have this 4-hour cut out there somewhere that like really delves into the characters. And that's great because you have Joaquin Phoenix and you have Vanessa Kirby in this film giving spectacular performances for what they're given, but they're not given a lot in it to really flush things out. We get this kind of like eccentric performance from Joaquin Phoenix, which doesn't feel like it fits into the film because we don't know the character of Napoleon enough to understand. I think the one thing when in that movie, when Napoleon comes back from his exile and all of a sudden the soldiers start turning on their commanders to go with him, you and I both have this response of, why is this happening? It hasn't been built up at all.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, to me, it's an average movie with, and you know what? A 4-hour director's cut, figure out a way to put it in. And that's the one thing, like, I do feel like sometimes with these directors and everything like that, they get a little too into their own heads of like, well, if I could have just made the picture I wanted. It's like, okay, but great storytellers can figure it out. Like there have been many people who have made a great 3-hour movie, a great 2-hour movie, a great 90-minute movie. So figure out how to do it.
It's one of those things that it comes up when we're talking about movies a lot, and this idea of like studio interference and stuff. And it feels like a lot of people say Ridley Scott is kind of like suffers from studio interference, where they're taking away a lot of his ideas. But one of the big complaints you have sometimes, Phil, is with like Netflix movies and how there's no studio interference with that. So we kind of get this schlock of just like there's too much information here. It needed someone to cut it down. And it feels like we just have, every time we get a Ridley Scott movie, it just feels like we have the wrong people telling how to narrow the movie down.
Yeah. Well, and, going into another one, and I think this is a 3-star movie, so I'm jumping up a little bit, but I know this is probably one of his most polarizing movies. I have Prometheus at 9. I know that some people like who are like diehard Alien fans absolutely hate this movie, and that's understandable. But ultimately what this one comes down to, and what I've been saying all along with these types of movies and with, when I sit down to watch a alien type movie, at the end of the day, I just want to be entertained. And Prometheus entertained me. And I'm not so caught up in the history of Wayland Enterprises or whatever the hell it's called. I'm not so caught up in that stuff. Okay. I just want to watch the movie. And Prometheus, to me, maybe it was also like when it came out, I was in high school or I was in college. So like, I was going to the movies all the time, and I was seeing a lot of bad movies at the same time. Prometheus, I love Fassbender in it. Noomi Rapace, where did she go? I miss her. She was so good for a little period of time there, and then she vanished off the face of the earth. Guy Pearce is solid. The story is okay, even though it's a little confusing in parts, and I'm sure John can speak to it more than I can. But at the end of the day, 3-star movie, that'll land you in the top 9 of Ridley Scott films.
For me, Prometheus comes up later in my list, and it was one that I wasn't sure if I was going to include in my list or not. My most recent watching of it, I've kind of started coming around more and more on the film just by dissociating it from the Alien franchise a little bit. And that's really helped my enjoyment of the film, in all honesty. And of course, like when I first saw it, I didn't know it was associated with the Alien franchise because they kind of kept that under wraps when it was first released. Prometheus, to me, is like that line where we go from, okay, Ridley Scott's making good movies to Ridley Scott's making great movies. So we'll talk about it a little bit later when I get there.
Okay. I'm curious because I actually thought, so you have Prometheus higher on your list.
I do. Not terribly higher, but a bit higher.
But that surprises me because I could have seen this being a movie that you're just like, I hate this movie.
I was that way for a while. It was really only on my most recent watch of it that I've come around on it.
Okay, I'm excited to hear about that then, because this honestly was a movie that I was assuming you were just going to be so negative on, that there was going to be no reason for, that you were going to be like, I can't believe you even have that. So I'm excited to talk about it. But let's jump into
my number 9.
Yeah, let's jump into your number 9. Sorry, I'm getting blown up over. I got to put my phone on mute. People are hitting me up. Joe Mixon just scored a 45-yard rushing touchdown. I know nobody cares about that, but I'm in a guillotine league where the lowest score gets knocked out, and I'm in last place, but I have Joe Mixon, so people are texting me a lot of F words right now. So that's what it is. So I just muted that, everybody. There you go. And Kevin Hernandez, great point here. The cinematography alone makes Prometheus top 10.
And that's some of Ridley Scott's just like best stuff is his cinematography.
Yeah.
Except when it's not his best stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
His worst things.
Exactly.
It's so wild, and that's what makes Ridley Scott such a enigma of a director, in my opinion. My number 9, I'm actually going a lot older into Ridley Scott's repertoire here. And this is one that, again, when we're talking about Ridley Scott, a lot of the times, Ridley Scott's not a writer. He's not writing his own movies. He gets scripts. He turns them into movies. But he tends to get like these really paper thin scripts a lot, very like basic scripts. And I think this is about as basic of a script as you can get. I am going back to Legend.
I've never seen that. And I'm going to say something to you right now, John, that's going to blow your mind. Until you had sent me the list the other day of like movies that you were watching, I'd never heard of Legend.
Legend is one of those movies that I think a lot of people have never heard of. They might have seen like the VHS cover for it. It has a pretty iconic like movie poster with
look right now
with
like the smoke and stuff and
like darkness and every like the character of the darkness, sorry, played by Tim Curry in this, and you have Tom Cruise. It's a very early Tom Cruise movie. He's super young in this. It's a very basic fantasy film. It's just good versus evil. The darkness is trying to kill the last unicorn so that he can be eternal night and he can rule over everything. That's literally the plot of this movie. Tom Cruise is like the hero. It doesn't even really get into a hero's journey when you break into it. But boy, oh boy, the costume design, the set design, the spectacle of this movie is phenomenal enough to get it into number 9. It's enjoyable. It's a shorter Ridley Scott movie, which helps a lot too. It looks absolutely fantastic, despite the fact that the script is very basic. It kind of comes off as like a kid's story, in all honesty, when you really break it down. And in fact, like that's when I first saw this. I got this as a Christmas present one year as a kid. And I was like, sure, let's watch it. And I hadn't watched it in years since then until my recent rewatch. And it's just the presence of this film. It just feels so good. It looks so phenomenal. Right up there with some of the best fantasy films and in terms of like style and just the look that it brings.
It's funny with this. I'd never heard of it. Now that I see that there's a character named Honeythorn Gump, I will go out of my way to watch this movie. But no, you're talking about it very positively. I'll have to check it out. It's only 94 minutes, which is very hard to find with Ridley Scott. His movies are long as hell. They are so long, which is why I didn't do much binging before we got on this podcast. It was a lot of what have I seen and what do I remember, because his movies are long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, moving into 8 is actually one of his more recent movies. I'm going with The Last Duel from 2002. This is the one
2002?
2022.
I was going to say, dude, that movie. So let's not talk too much about this one yet, because I actually have it higher.
Okay. Yeah.
The Last Duel, though, nobody saw it. And that was the joke. I remember even at the Oscars, it was like, hey, who here saw The Last Duel? Okay, great. Like, can you tell us what it was about? Because nobody saw it. And I think like Jimmy Kimmel made the joke at the Oscars where it was like something along the lines of like, we have something nobody's ever seen before, DVDs of The Last Duel or something like that. But that movie's really good. And I want to talk about the structure when we get to it and everything like that, because that's one that I guarantee you most people haven't seen. And it's probably, you have Legend on here, but I would almost bet less people have seen The Last Duel.
Yeah. It came out in, remember, this is the year Ridley Scott had 2 movies, because this is the same year as House of Gucci.
God,
and House of Gucci got a lot of attention, and The Last Duel was kind of just passed over, despite the fact that, like, even back when these movies were releasing, The Last Duel seemed like the more interesting one. Yet I hadn't seen it until recently, and it surprised me because I was a little worried because I wasn't that high on House of Gucci. So, yeah, we'll talk about it a little bit later when it comes up.
The Last Duel came out in 2021.
Oh, sorry,
but it was because of all the COVID stuff, so it was really playing in theaters in 2022 still. Because that was like around the time where things were just starting to get back into theaters,
right?
At a little bit wider of releases. But yeah, I saw that in theaters in February 7th, 2022. Solid movie, but we'll talk about it in a second here. And we can speed a little bit here because I have The Martian as my number 8. So again, The Martian, star-studded cast, solid movie, just a little overrated. But to me, you gave it 2.5 stars. I think it's a solid 3. Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with The Martian. There's just nothing particularly great about The Martian, which is why I ultimately have it here at number 3. Or number 8.
Yeah. I think one of the big things with The Martian for me is some of them, like I said, like the more interesting things are just kind of glossed over in the movie. Like, again, like we don't want to inundate the audience with a bunch of science jargon. Like, obviously, Nolan did that the year before with Interstellar, and it worked. Most of the time, when people do that in their movies, it doesn't work. Especially Ridley Scott, who tends to have a lot of inaccuracies in his movies when it comes to factual information.
He doesn't care about that.
He doesn't. He's just like, whatever, this looks cool, let's put it in the movie, which is fine. That's totally fine. But the thing that gets me with The Martian is I think the most compelling aspect of this entire movie is the idea that the crew can go back and get him. And the moral dilemma of, like, do we tell them he's still alive so that they feel guilty about leaving him there? And then do they make the decision to go back for him, even though it might cost them their lives? And it will cost them several, like, years of their lives.
Yeah.
And that's the most interesting aspect of it. And it's just glossed over. It's like 10 minutes of the movie.
Well, and exactly. And like, that's what Interstellar got more into, right? It got more into a year here is, a 10 minutes here is 10 years there, or whatever the timeline is on the water planet and things like that. Interstellar definitely got more into the science, and like The Martian gets into the science. I mean, The Martian, somebody in here, Brendan Pfeiffer says, we watched The Martian in 2 separate high school science classes after it came out. It was sick. Like, it is a good movie, and it does get into some of the science of it all. But to me, it's like, The Martian's a more Hollywoodized version of what I'd like to see from my science fiction. It's a solid movie. It's if you were to tell me, like, rank your best, like, space science fiction movies, it might come close to my top 15 or so, because I don't know how many more are up there. But at the same time, like, it doesn't ask the big questions, which is what I like from those types of science fiction movies, right? Interstellar does that. Space Odyssey does that. This movie doesn't really do that.
No, and it's fine, because we don't always need movies that are asking big questions. Our movies don't always have to be super heady. And I think that's something that we've very much demonstrated throughout the years of doing this podcast now, is that we like all spectrums of movies when it comes to that. It's fine for a movie just to be enjoyable. The Martian, I honestly, it's one of those movies that I think we would compare to, like, this is the type of movie that if it's on, you'll sit and watch it, but you might not seek it out all the time.
It's that TNT movie. That's what it is. But they did make it seem like it was more than that, which I think was a little frustrating.
And people love this movie.
They love it. And you know what? You can love it. Just, what was the 2015 Oscars? Let me see. This is important. I always like going to this because then this is where I can determine whether or not people should have been praising it as much as they were. Okay, so it's giving me the wrong year. I hate when you type in 2015 Oscars, it gives you the 2014 Oscars and then goes back. Okay, so this is what else was nominated that year. Mad Max Fury Road. Was that a better directed movie or what? Yeah. I'd say. The Revenant, Room, Brooklyn, The Big Short, Spotlight, Bridge of Spies. Honestly, The Martian's probably the 7th or 8th best movie out of the 8 Best Picture nominees that year.
Yeah, probably. I think it's one of the most easily digestible of those movies, though.
Exactly. Okay. Let's move forward. So at my 7, I do have The Last Duel. So again, not much further ahead, which is why I also kind of wanted to stop you. So the way that The Last Duel works, because I know a lot of people probably don't know what this movie is, so we might as well chat it up a little bit here. Maybe this is one we should have done for our $5 Tuesdays, because John's about to do nothing but take a dump on poor Black Hawk Down, which never did anything to him. But so the thing is with The Last Duel is it is told as 3 different versions of the same story, right? So you're getting different. Is it of this? I haven't seen it a little bit, but it's not showing the exact same timeline for each, right? But it is showing different variations of the same story.
It's the same timeline. It takes place in the same time frame, but it is the different perspectives of the 3 main players. So you have the perspective of Matt Damon's character, of Adam Driver's character, and of, my God, I should have looked up this actress's name before we started talking about this.
The one who is literally the best person in the movie? Yeah, Jodie Comer.
Yeah, Jodie Comer, who, by far is the best person in the movie. Yeah. It shows it from their different perspectives. It's Rashomon. It's a Rashomon story.
It's a Rashomon story. My biggest complaint with this movie, I love the first 2 parts. The third part didn't do it for me, which I think the third part is her story, and it's the one that's supposed to be the most impactful. Yeah. And it didn't do it for me. I didn't feel like it was different enough, but it's a very compelling story. And it's very well done. It's great acting. It looks awesome. The action sequences are out of this world. I loved it. Like, I loved it until the third act. And then the third act, I was like, I wanted a little bit more. But still, this is probably the most underrated Ridley Scott movie, with the exception of one, which Shane Cupp had put at the beginning, was Today Years Old When I Learned Matchstick Men was Ridley Scott. That's got to be his most underrated. It was so good. I didn't realize it was Ridley Scott until about 3 weeks ago. So I'm excited to sit down and talk about that one. But yes, The Last Duel, if you haven't seen it, it's got to be easy to find nowadays. Like, it had to have been picked up by a streamer for super cheap. It's got Ridley Scott's name attached to it.
Disney Plus. It was on Disney Plus in Canada. I don't know if it is down there.
Yeah, it wouldn't be down here. But that does make sense.
Hulu, then.
Hulu is probably
been part of the Fox acquisition.
Okay. Yeah, it's solid though. Matt Damon, Adam Driver, Ben Affleck. Check it out. It's worth it.
I will say Ben Affleck is by far the worst part of that entire movie.
Ben Affleck's the worst part of every movie, but there's something so homey about him. I'd watch Ben Affleck eat ice for 2 hours. I don't care. Ben Affleck's entertaining.
The reason why The Last Duel didn't end up, because I also quite enjoyed this movie. I did appreciate the third one, but you have to be paying a lot of attention in the third story in order for it to pay off, because there's so much, and it's weird. I think this is kind of like the performers brought this out, and it isn't necessarily Ridley Scott who brought this out of his performers. There's so much nuance in the performances and the differences in those performances by each of the actors in each section of the film. Where it's like, you're definitely seeing the perception of the person whose truth it is, as it's like titled, and you see their perception of these other people in those moments. And it's good. Honestly, like Matt Damon's performance in this, really underrated. I don't think it's the best performance, but the differences between each of the 3 stories from Matt Damon's with Matt Damon and the way he portrays his character, fantastic. So good. The weird thing about this movie, the script can't decide how it wants to present itself. And I'm not talking like story-wise. I'm talking dialogue-wise. There is some really weird casual dialogue in this movie.
I don't remember it well enough to remember that.
Well, and that was my problem with Ben Affleck's character. He comes off very casual, and as Ben Affleck's character comes off as if he is someone from modern day being in a movie back then and talking like modern day.
I am worried about that with Denzel in Gladiator 2.
That's fair.
Yeah, I am concerned about that.
But other than that, like if you can get, and that again, that's why this is like a 3-star movie and not a 3.5 or 4-star movie.
Yeah,
because like it does have these inconsistencies, but Ridley Scott's direction is really good in it. The cinematography is really good in it. It does have those like really cringy like topics of like, you know, the entire like trigger warning, I guess, but like the entire plot of this movie revolves around a rape, just like Rashomon. So
yeah,
it is literally just a medieval Rashomon. Like it's Rashomon set in medieval France instead of Japan.
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's jump off. What is your number 7?
Blade Runner.
Okay, so what's your number 6? No, I'm just kidding.
So Blade Runner doesn't get that high on my list. And honestly, I couldn't find the theatrical cut of this to rewatch it. I had to watch the final cut.
You're a lucky man, dude.
That I could find.
You're a lucky man.
But Blade Runner is such an interesting film, and I know it has its big following, and I know especially after Denis Villeneuve comes out and makes what a lot of people consider a far superior sequel to the film.
So much better. Not even close, in my opinion. Denis Villeneuve's movie is phenomenal.
I still haven't seen Blade Runner 2049. So I don't know. I can't comment on it.
Well, I will say this. I hate Blade Runner. I thought Blade Runner 2049 was fantastic. Again, I'll let you talk Blade Runner, and then I'll kind of get into. Look, I control people all day about why I think Blade Runner sucks, but I actually get into why I dislike it. So go ahead.
There are some very interesting aspects of the film. I understand what Ridley Scott's going for in this movie. Obviously, like it's based off of Philip K. Dick's book. What do androids dream of electric sheep? Androids
dream of electric sheep? Yeah,
and which is like a seminal piece of science fiction. And for it to get this adaptation, which does take liberties with the original works, as most, Ridley Scott, we already talked about it. Ridley Scott takes liberties with everything.
Yep.
And in this case, there's this, it starts off with it's a very interesting concept. And it's this like neo-noir, but it never feels like Ridley Scott captures that. And that is kind of one of my critiques of Ridley Scott as a director. A lot of the time, it feels like he's doing genre work without understanding the genre he's making. I looked back at my review for House of Gucci when I watched that, and it said, it feels like Ridley Scott was trying to make The Godfather without ever seeing The Godfather. And
I do remember you putting that review. That was a good one.
And Blade Runner feels like Ridley Scott's trying to make a noir film without ever have watched a noir film before. And,
so what? Go ahead.
And there are elements that are really good. The last half hour of this movie is spectacular. But it's the lead up to that. And I know a lot of people might complain because it's really slow. I enjoy slow burn movies. I enjoy that aspect of it. But it never feels like it really gets into the questions that this type of science fiction is really asking. It never gets into the, like, it presents these ideas of like, okay, but are these replicants, like, are they
everybody always says with the ending, like, oh, is he a replicant or not? And I'm like, I don't give a shit. You lost me. I don't care.
And that's kind of the problem with it, right? Like,
yeah,
it never goes that extra distance. And again, this is the problem with Ridley Scott movies in general. They don't go the extra distance a lot of the time. When they do, they are some phenomenal films. But when they don't, they're just stuck in this like mediocrity of 2 to 3 star movies, and they can't surpass that. And Blade Runner has a solid performance from Harrison Ford. It has some good ideas. It just doesn't seem to have captured them in the best possible way, but it is an enjoyable film still.
Yeah, and here's Kevin Hernandez. From a technical standpoint, Blade Runner is impressive. Otherwise, I agree with Phil. Well, I watched this in a high school class. So we had a film class in high school. The public school I went to, it lasted literally 2 years and then it went away because God forbid public schools do anything nice in America. But it's like, sorry, I had to get that out because it was a fun class and then it went away. But I had seen this before the high school class, so I didn't like the first version. And then I watched the same version. So this was the theatrical version both times. The thing for me is, and my high school teacher, who I still respect very much, he said, but think about all the movies that this movie inspired. And my whole thing is, who cares? I understand that it inspired movies. That doesn't mean it's good. And I guess the hardest part for me with Blade Runner is I don't understand why people like it so much. I just don't. And I wish I did. I wish I could put my finger on what it was about this movie that people love so much. It feels like one of those movies that got the hype, and all of a sudden people were like, this is one of the greatest movies ever. It doesn't hit the Space Odyssey level. And people will sit there and say that this is a better movie than Gladiator or a better movie than what do you call it? God, where's it? Alien. And it's like, no, like I just don't see that. And I don't understand why. And to me, like, I like slow movies. This movie is molasses. And it's not interesting to me. I don't find it fascinating in any way. And you know, like, it doesn't matter how good the acting is, doesn't matter how good it looks. If I'm not involved in the story at all, I'm gonna want to turn it off. I have seen Blade Runner, no joke, 5 times, at least 5 times, different versions, whatever. I never liked it, and I'm not gonna watch it again.
Yep, I think again, Blade Runner really goes to show this aspect of Ridley Scott that frustrates me, and is he doesn't know how to build characters. And if he does, they're in his director's cuts. Kingdom of Heaven. Again, I'm going to go back to it because I thought Kingdom of Heaven was going to end up in my top 10 until I rewatched it and realized that is one of the worst movies I've ever seen. That theatrical cut is terrible. And the reason why I thought it was going to end up in my top 10, the copy of Kingdom of Heaven I own, is the director's cut, which goes into the political aspect of the film a little bit more and into the conflict of the Crusades and into character. The theatrical cut has no character. And that's what's so devoid in Blade Runner at times. It feels like there are characters interacting with each other, but it doesn't feel like they're responding to each other at all.
Yeah, it feels like we're watching dialogue in a movie. Yeah.
And it's, you know what, I think, like, for the time period it came out from, it is very impressive technically. It looks great. It has very, like I said, very interesting concepts to dissect. I think the conversation about Blade Runner is a bit more interesting than the movie Blade Runner, but it's still done well.
Yeah, I think the conversation is more interesting. I don't like the story. What do you have at number 6? Let's move off of Blade Runner before I close out this podcast.
Number 6, I have Prometheus. This is my line. This is my line for Ridley Scott. This is Ridley Scott's made good movies. And after this, we get into, Ridley Scott makes very good to great movies. Prometheus, the last bit of this movie is the worst part of this movie. And that's, I think, leaves a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths because you know what they say, right? It's not how you start, it's how you finish.
Yep.
And Prometheus finishes with this, like, I can't even, like, really explain it the best way possible, but it switches from this very interesting philosophical science fiction movie to a very standard alien movie.
Yeah.
And it's so unfortunate because everything that happens prior to that last half hour is fascinating. The idea of, was life on Earth intentionally created by these other beings? What happens when we meet our creator? Like, these are huge philosophical questions that people have been trying to answer literally since they could think.
Yeah.
And Ridley Scott poses in a great way, has this phenomenal cast. I mean, you mentioned the cast earlier, didn't even mention Charlize Theron in this.
Yeah.
Idris Elba in this. Like, this cast is stacked. Like most Ridley Scott movies. I
was just going to say, it's like, that's what he's good at, is compiling the cast.
The incoming casting ensemble Oscar that we are getting eventually, Ridley Scott's just going to start winning it every year because of the cast he gets.
He needs to stay alive, and I know he's older, so I'm not saying, I don't want this to be taken lightly, but he needs to stay alive long enough and make at least 1 or 2 movies so that he can get that Oscar. because that's how he's going to win his Oscar. He should have won his Oscar for Gladiator, for directing. He lost to Steven Soderbergh for Traffic, which Traffic is phenomenal. And Steven Soderbergh does a great job directing. But I agree with you about Prometheus. And I feel like that's how a lot of these alien movies are. The third acts are just so predictable, with the exception of the original Alien and Aliens. Everything after that, it's like, okay, it's like they were just getting to the third act to get to the third act, right? And Prometheus, it's like everything it built up and everything that it set up and everything that the entire audience is going, oh man, this is sick. It just kind of says, okay, that's enough. We've had enough of that.
Yeah, well, and that's, again, like one of these issues with Ridley Scott. And I think it's also the reason why, I think part of the reason why Alien feels so different is because it came first.
Yeah.
And then, and I even explained that, well, maybe not to you, but I've explained it to many people after seeing Alien Romulus. I feel like this series that like people love so much is just so repetitive, and there's not much space to explore in it. And that's why we kind of get the same movie over and over again. And Prometheus tried to do something different, but then reverted back to the same old. And then we got Alien Covenant afterwards, which also like almost does the thing, goes back to the same thing, but then decides to give us a CGI xenomorph in the process, and it's just worse. That's why Alien Covenant didn't make my top 10. It was very close because it's like right there on the line, but ultimately, like, I can't put it over The Martian. Because The Martian's just a better science fiction movie, and Prometheus has good ideas. And again, it's this idea of like not going all the way. It doesn't quite get there, and it doesn't quite push the boundary enough. Michael Fassbender in this film, absolutely spectacular.
Yeah, and this is when Fassbender was heating up, man. Fassbender was just in his rhythm at this point, where like everything he touched was turning to gold. Like he was just on a heater, unlike any other at that point in time. So I love Fassbender in this movie. I love Fassbender in pretty much everything, like I said, that came out from around this era. And like you said about Alien, and we'll talk about Alien a little bit. Alien defined the genre, right? Like Alien defined and that's what kind of confuses me with Blade Runner, like we were just talking about. Why Blade Runner, that came out 3 years after? It comes out 3 years after. Why does that movie get more credit from a science fiction standpoint? I don't get it.
Probably because of the horror elements of Alien, have it like falling more into the horror category for a lot of people, I would imagine.
I guess that's fair. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Okay, let's move off. Shall we?
Yes. Okay.
So you got to do. Oh, I'm on my 6.
No, it's you're 6.
American Gangster. This is one of those movies. So this is my last almost great, almost perfect Ridley Scott movie. It's almost perfect, but it's not quite there.
Yeah.
American Gangster. When this movie came out, I'll never forget when this movie came out, because it came out in 2007, which is one of the best years for film ever. And we've talked about that relentlessly. Atonement, No Country for Old Men, There Will Be Blood. And that's just naming 3 of the 5 Oscar noms. The others were Juno and Michael Clayton. Then a movie like American Gangster comes out. Ridley Scott directed. It has Chiwetel Ejiofor, which I can never say his last name. And then it has Denzel Washington, Russell Crowe. It's got Ted Levine. Like, where the hell had Ted Levine been? I'm stoked he's back. It has all these great performances. Ruby Dee, who John and I will talk about, does not deserve the Oscar, the Golden Globe win, I think she got over Saoirse Ronan and all that. But just a phenomenal idea, right? Like, I'm trying to come up with, like, it's not the actual movie that is great. It was everything building up to it. People were like, holy shit. Is Ridley Scott going to get his Oscar? Russell Crowe and Denzel are going to get this. And it almost had that, I don't know, it had that feel of sometimes there's too many cooks in the kitchen. And so when it actually came out, it got a little lost. And it was very popular from a box office perspective. But from an award season perspective, it almost got lumped into how I feel The Martian should have been. But I do feel that 17 years later, and maybe I'm wrong on this. I'm looking at the date down here. Maybe I'm wrong on this, but 17 years later, I do feel that people have almost forgotten about this movie and how good this movie is. And it's Denzel's performance. It's Russell Crowe's performance. It's the story. It's very, very stylized, which I will say when it comes to Ridley Scott movies, style's not what I would go with. He makes a lot of movies that are like great from a theme perspective. They look amazing, all that, but style isn't what I think of. This movie is very stylistic. and it's very of the era. And it's a really entertaining movie that just like is missing a little something of the special sauce to make it a perfect 4-star movie, like the 5 movies that I have ahead of it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, not to spoil things too much. This is my number 5 movie, so I might as well just talk about it now.
Oh, so we both have it at 5, so it's perfect.
Well, you have it at 6, but
I have it at 6, dude. I am like, you know what it is? I keep typing in because I thought I was going to go, so I had my 5 typed in already on here.
Go. Yeah.
So now I have to start this. Okay, so go ahead. Talk American Gangster.
But American Gangsters, it's really interesting. I think it's exactly like you said. It's so close to being a perfect movie. In fact, when I first watched it, I gave it 4 stars. And then when I first watched it, like recently, I was like, oh yeah, this is a 4-star movie. And then you think about it a little bit longer. And then you watch a couple more Ridley Scott's, like those movies that are perfect, that are above it. And you're like, never mind. I have to put this down. It's not as good as these other movies. It has to be a 1.5 because it's not quite there. And there are a lot of really good elements of this. Denzel Washington's performance, spectacular. Like
he didn't get an Oscar nomination either, did he?
No.
That's crazy.
No.
So popular too. You would have thought he would have gotten it automatic, but yeah, it sucks.
Yeah, Russell Crowe also very good. It is unfortunate. Part of the story of this is a bit unfortunate because it spends a little bit too much time with Russell Crowe's character and not enough time like delving into Denzel Washington's character, who I think is the much more interesting character in this movie. However, there's this fantastic juxtaposition between the two characters and the way they are approaching things. Right, like Russell Crowe is the only non-corrupt cop in New York and New Jersey in this movie, seemingly. He turns in
might
the $1 million.
Be true.
Yeah, very well could be. Turns in the money at the beginning of the movie, the $1 million at the beginning of the movie, and everyone's like, oh, now we just think you're like all the cops don't want to deal with him anymore, right? And there's also this aspect of him dealing with his divorce and the custody of his son, and the fact that like one of the friends he hangs out with is a criminal. And then like that later develops into this whole entanglement of these two characters and everything. And there is actually one actor you forgot to mention who kind of had a very big year in 2007, Josh Brolin.
Oh, like Josh Brolin, dude. Yeah.
Movie.
Yeah.
He's the dirty New York cop who is antagonizing Denzel Washington the entire time and antagonizing Russell Crowe the entire time. He's the third point on this triangle that this movie is investigating. And it does almost get there. It's so fascinating. It just, again, lacks that little bit of extra character development that Ridley Scott movies so often lack to get it over that hump to make it a perfect film.
Which I will say this, my top 5, I have 0 complaints about characters. For my top 5.
I have
0 complaints.
Complained about a character in one of your top 5 movies, but
that's fine. And you know what though? I will say this about that movie: the character is the least important part of that movie. So we can talk about that here briefly. But let me do my 5 since you jumped me. I'm just trying to live my life and have a good time. And you're doing segues that make sense. Like, John, what is that? We don't have time for segues that make sense. Hang on. I actually, for some reason, when I copied it over, American Gangster did not type in. Okay. Oh, man. All right. My number 5. Probably the least Ridley Scott movie ever. Thelma and Louise. Do you have Thelma and Louise in yours?
It's higher than this.
Okay. I had copy and paste. So anybody who's watching along here, bear with me as I try to deal with all of the fun that goes on in trying to get this ticker to work. Okay. Thelma and Louise is awesome.
Yes.
And this was one of those movies when it first came out, or not when it first came out. I don't remember when it first came out. Obviously, it came out in 1991. I was born in 1992. But Thelma and Louise was one of those movies when I was growing up that people always talked about. You got to see Thelma and Louise. That's a really good one. The cast of characters, I'm just going to list off everybody in this. Susan Sarandon, Gina Davis, Harvey Keitel, Michael Madsen, Christopher McDonald, Stephen Tobolowsky. Those are all the people who are billed above Brad Pitt. Okay. Yeah. I just needed you to know that all those people. I used to live in North Hollywood, California. I walked past Stephen Tobolowsky on the street numerous times. I never walked past Brad Pitt on the street, but Brad Pitt was billed behind Stephen Tobolowsky at this point. Thelma and Louise, though, is one of those movies that just goes there. It just keeps going. And it's got probably one of the most iconic endings ever. Probably one of the most iconic endings that people probably don't realize is from this, right? Like, I don't know what else people would think it was from, but maybe people don't even like put together that it's from a movie, that it really is a thing. But that ending is so good. And essentially this movie is just about like two women who they get caught up in something they shouldn't have, really, not that they're caught up in it. One of them gets assaulted and then they kill the guy. So now they have to run away. Yeah. And that's the plot. Go ahead.
I'm going to save my thoughts on this until we hit it on my list, because it does come a little bit longer. And I'm pretty much in agreement with Kevin Hernandez on this.
Yeah. When the script does become predictable after a certain point, especially when you're watching this 30-something years later, like it's so predictable eventually. Thelma may be one of the best directed, written, and acted characters in a Ridley Scott movie. 100%. 100%. So yeah, we'll talk about that when we get there. So I'll let you get to that one. I guess I'm on 4 then.
It would be my 4 because I would do 5-4.
Well, you did your 5 after I did my 5. So, or before I did my 5. So I think it might be my
However
turn.
You want to do it, go for it.
I want to do it this way because I want to go first.
Okay.
I did end up, John, much to the chagrin of you, I did go with Matchstick Men at number 4.
Matchstick Men is also my number 4.
Oh, okay, good. So we're both doing
it. We're arguing, and we actually just have the exact same movie in the exact same spot.
So we were just wasting our time with that whole statement. This was a movie I just watched for the first time because of this podcast. This is going to be our $5 Tuesday in 2 weeks. So for the final week of November, if you're a patron, patreon.com/thespecialist, we're going to be doing Matchstick Men on the 26th. We're doing Black Hawk Down for tomorrow. So get in there if you want to hear us talk more in depth about those two Ridley Scott movies. Matchstick Men is fucking awesome. Like, that's all I can say about this movie. So this was the first time I watched it. So I don't feel like I can put it over Black Hawk Down, which I've seen half a dozen times at this point. But it might be better than Black Hawk Down. And this could very well be one of those movies that I keep going back to that could end up just being one of my favorite crime movies ever made. It is such a beautiful story. So well told. Nicolas Cage's performance is absolutely out of this world. It'll keep you guessing, kind of, although it does get a little predictable near the end, but still, the movie isn't so much about the insanity of what's going on, right? The movie isn't so much about the insanity of the twist. It's more about the insanity of how Nicolas Cage's character reacts to everything that happens to him. And I don't want to spoil what that means. But where does this movie come from in Ridley Scott's repertoire? And why did this come out in 2003 and nobody talk about it anymore?
I have no idea. I had not, when I was going through all the Ridley Scott movies, I had never heard of this movie. It's 2003. It's Nicolas Cage. Like, this is Nicolas Cage right off Adaptation. This is Ridley Scott right off Gladiator, right off Black Hawk Down. Like, this should be a formula for success here. And quite frankly, it is. This movie is spectacular. Nicolas Cage.
Sam Rockwell.
We can never forget Sam Rockwell because we can never sing Sam Rockwell's praise enough. This movie, I wasn't sure what I was getting into when I started watching this movie. And yes, there's a twist in it, and I think the twist gets a lot of talk rather than what deserves all the talk of this movie, which is Nicolas Cage's performance, because he is absolutely spectacular in this movie. There is so much heart and warmth in this portrayal by Nicolas Cage of this con man who all of a sudden meets his daughter. Yeah. It's so fantastic.
And so if you've never heard of this movie, because so when this movie came out, this was a big blockbuster rental, right? Like, people were all over this movie. Check it out. And I don't think my dad ever picked it up, so I never watched it. It came out when I was 11 years old, and then as I got older, people never talked about it. Like I said, I didn't even realize it was a Ridley Scott movie. I knew what Matchstick Men was, but I didn't realize it was a Ridley Scott movie. Like, that cover is burned into my brain of the three of them standing there with the white backdrop. And so what this movie is about is Nicolas Cage has OCD. He's got so many different phobias and all of this stuff. But he's a con man, and he's good at what he does. And his whole life, though, is then upended when his teenage daughter, who he didn't know existed, comes to live with him. And it's just such a great movie. Alison Lohman as the daughter, phenomenal story. And the ending, like, more so the last shot of this movie just left me being like, damn, man, they just knew what they were doing the entire time. Like, it was just such a well put together movie. The acting, the story, and it's one of those crime movies that actually does surprise. And that's a hard thing to say in 2024. I feel like I've seen so many movies at this point. It surprised me, and I like that. So that's my number 4. It's your number 4. We're going to be talking about it heavily on November 26th.
Yeah. So we won't delve into it more there, but yeah, this is one of those instances where you're like, maybe Ridley Scott can direct a movie.
Yeah. Now we're both going to have the same top 2, maybe in a different order. I don't remember how.
I'm pretty sure we probably have the same order.
Okay, let's do both 3s then. I'll do my 3 first because I've already talked about it, and then we can do yours. Okay. I have Black Hawk Down. This is a movie that John did not like. I'm going to make him save all of that for the Patreon because I'm just going to talk about why I did like it. Here's my thing with Black Hawk Down. So actually, John, you brought up a good point, and I'll give you credit where you deserve it sometimes. You had said to me the other day, we were texting back and forth, and you said to me that this movie is about, what do you call it? That this movie is a pro-war movie. So you want to, did you do any research into Black Hawk Down after watching it or no? Because I actually have something funny to
I did a lot, and it actually made me like the movie less.
So, but here's what's really funny to me. Ridley Scott wanted this movie to be much more anti-war than it was. When I watched this movie, I think of this movie as an anti-war movie. Now, John texted me and said, no, it's pro-war. It's American propaganda. You know, he started throwing around the buzzwords that made me say, okay, John, calm down. It's okay.
I'm Canadian.
I know. So John's Canadianness really came out, and I wanted to be like, all right, dude, do I need to like hide my address from you? Like, am I safe? But the funny thing is, when I watch this movie, I read the words, whatever, the description at the beginning and the description at the end. And to me, it's so anti-war. It's the pointlessness of war. These Americans who are dying because the government doesn't care that they're there because they want to get this bigger fish who's literally not impacting American life like at all. Why are they there? Like, this is something that they're never really gonna be able to clean up this problem, right? Like, that's what I get from it. But what's funny is, in order to use a Black Hawk in the movie, to get one from the US military, it had to be a more pro-war movie because the military was not willing to rent out a Black Hawk to a film unless the movie was pro-war.
That makes so much sense. Like, absolutely so much sense. Because if you read some of the actors' testimony after this movie came out, they're like, this isn't the script that we had.
Yeah.
So this is one of those instances where there is studio interference and everything like that. And it's very interesting. Maybe this is one where the director's cut is something that I would enjoy a lot more than the theatrical, but I will save all of my complaints about it for Patreon.
So, and I just want to say this though, but all that aside, to me, the direction in this movie, when I watch a movie, I like to say to myself, could I have done that? Right? Like Matchstick Men, I feel like I could have written that movie, which gives me hope. Right, because I want to be a writer. Like, I am a writer. Like, that is what I do. Actually, I don't write movies, but I am a writer in my regular life. But when I look at that, I'm like, oh man, can I make a Matchstick Man? But when it comes to directing, I can't direct. Right, I don't know how to direct. So I need to watch a movie, and when I see it and I say, how the hell did they do this? I'm saying that's a great directed movie because that's not just amateur hour shit. I have no idea how they put this movie together. It is nonstop, guns blazing, chaos all the time around these characters. There are so many characters to keep track of, and yet I can no problem the entire time. I just think the direction in this movie is outstanding, and therefore I have it as my number 3. And honestly, like, it could be the best directed movie by Ridley Scott just because of I don't know how they pulled it off. I don't know where they shot this movie. I don't know how they shot this movie. I don't know how they kept it so that everything kind of looks like it never loses continuity. And I'll talk more about it on the Patreon, but that was just my big thing. The direction is what does it for me.
I think a lot of people say this when it comes to Ridley Scott. In fact, I'm pretty sure I had a YouTube video come up this week that said like the 3 secrets to a Ridley Scott action scene. And what it comes down to is Ridley Scott is a phenomenal director of action scenes.
He is. He really is.
I can't argue that.
No. And Brendan Pfeiffer says, to me, every war I've seen is anti-war. I can't remember one personally that takes the stance of this is a good thing that's happening that we are showing. Go watch some movies from the 40s. Those are real propaganda movies. So when John said propaganda the other day, I was about to be like, have you ever seen any war movie from the 40s when they were like, World War II's sick? Like, come on, guys, let's hang out. World War II, it's a good time. So anyway, let's jump off. What's your number 3?
Well, by process of elimination, we have the same 1 and 2. It has to be Thelma and Louise.
True. I totally forgot. Okay. Yeah, you're right.
It's Thelma and Louise. This movie surprised me so much. And I really struggled with whether I liked it more or less than Matchstick Men. And eventually I just decided I did like it more because the character growth of Thelma in this movie is spectacular. And Louise. Like, both Susan Sarandon and Gina Davis give absolutely spectacular performances in this movie. It's such a contained story, but it grows so much. And it's just this sense of these two women gaining their own freedom and independence and discovering who they really are throughout this film is so powerful. And of course, I mean, my introduction to Thelma and Louise is a season 5 episode of The Simpsons, Marge on the Lamb, right?
Of course, right?
But watching the entire movie play out, and I put it on and I'm watching it, and it's like, okay, whatever, they're going on this trip, then something bad's going to happen, and but it's the little bits of enjoyment that Gina Davis puts into her performance, where you can tell she's just enjoying what she's doing. When by the time we get to the gas station robbery, you're just like, this is a woman who, had been with her husband since they were children. Didn't really have her own identity, and is finally kind of getting free and understanding who she is. And it comes across in this movie so incredibly well. It's so fun the entire time, because especially with the differences in Thelma and Louise's characters, where Louise is really, the smarter one of the two. And Thelma kind of is like this, aw shucks, making the dumb mistakes, right? Like when she leaves the envelope of money in the hotel room with Brad Pitt's character.
Yeah.
And stuff like that, right? It's these little moments, but in all honesty, it's just the love these two women have for each other. Like this platonic love these two women have for each other that takes us to, again, one of the most iconic conclusions to a film ever. That is almost perfect. It's not quite perfect because there is like 3 seconds that ruins the ending shot. And that is the 3 seconds of Ridley Scott's signature slow motion of Harvey Keitel right before it cuts back to the car.
I feel that. I mean, I get that, although I won't let it take away for me.
I didn't let it take away. I didn't. That's how it ended up at number 3 and not number 4.
So here's the other thing, though, that I really want to go with here. Gina Davis, Susan Sarandon, both nominated for lead actress.
Yeah.
Lead. Now, neither one won because they went up against Jodie Foster for The Silence of the Lambs, which sucks.
Sorry.
Yeah, sucks to be you. But at the same time, it's like 2 women to be lead actors. That's how good these characters are written. And I do think because Ridley Scott has become more of a men director, right? He's become a man's director. You look at this movie, Gladiator, American Gangster, The Martian, Prometheus, Napoleon. People forget about this movie. Don't forget about this movie.
No.
All right? Don't forget about this movie. That's what I say. So, yeah, definitely worth checking out is Thelma and Louise. And if you haven't seen it, you're doing yourself a disservice. It's worth a watch.
It is. And it's one of those ones that you would never associate with Ridley Scott, but it is
exactly.
It really goes to show why Ridley Scott really made a name for himself, in all honesty.
Well, yeah, and it's kind of like when I look at this, Black Hawk Down, Matchstick Men, Thelma and Louise, The Last Duel. Those are 4 movies that I have in my top 10 of Ridley Scott movies that like aren't your typical, like he doesn't make war movies. He makes epics, like Gladiator's an epic, but he doesn't really make war movies. So anyway, all right. So do you go Alien then Gladiator or Gladiator?
Yeah, of course. Of course I go Alien then Gladiator.
Okay, so we do have the same top two. So let's look. We've done entire podcasts on both of these movies, so we're not going to be spending too much time here. But what is it about Alien and Gladiator that just make them classics? That no matter if you're a Ridley Scott fan or not, these have to be movies you're talking about.
I mean, Alien's literally one of the 5 defining films of the horror genre.
Mhm.
It is our sci-fi horror. It's our closed, like, I won't call it a cabin in the woods, but it's our claustrophobic horror film. It gives us, honestly, it's a slasher film when we really get down to it.
It is.
It is this like uncontested killing machine hunting down its prey. It has one of the greatest female action stars ever in Sigourney Weaver. Like, and again, this is like a defining role of her career, obviously. But even just like taking the character of Ripley and having that be like the final girl in this movie was not to be expected, especially when you look at the cast of the rest of this movie. Having John Hurt be the first person to die in this movie,
Yeah.
like it's Ridley Scott does such a good job at subverting expectations. This is a visually stunning film. Like, every aspect of this movie looks phenomenal, from the backgrounds to the sets themselves to the design of the xenomorph. It just all comes together so well, and it just feels like one of the most complete movies Ridley Scott has ever made.
Yeah. So what's funny about Alien to me is now that we are so far, I mean, 1979, we're talking 45 years ago. Like Kevin Hernandez says, what I love about Alien that's missing from other Alien movies, how good the supporting cast is. The thing with Alien is there is no supporting cast. They are all supporting cast. This is the ultimate ensemble movie, in my opinion. There is no other ensemble movie like Alien. Movies try, but there's always one star or one character who comes out above everybody else. And now we all know Ripley as iconic. But if you watch that movie, Ripley's not in it more than the other characters.
No.
She is not the character that we're following. And honestly, you could make the argument that the characters in this movie aren't great.
Mm-hmm.
Because they are kind of one note, right? They're all just like, they all work on this ship. You got the robot, you got this guy, whatever. But I think that's what makes it work so well. These guys don't have pasts. They don't have futures. They literally just exist. And so as a creature feature and all that, it's perfect. It's the best slasher movie ever made. It's so good. And yeah, that's all I got on that. So let's talk about Gladiator, because look, we're doing this podcast because Gladiator 2 is coming out on Friday. And right now it is Monday. I'm pumped for Gladiator 2. It better be damn good. Although, yeah, Kevin Hernandez, wait, we have to say this. Alien also has a lot of notorious deleted scenes. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. But we aren't talking about those. Gladiator is such a classic, man. And it does blow my mind a little bit that it's not like one of the most universally loved movies of all time. Why is it not one of the most universally loved movies of all time?
I don't know. It kind of comes off. I think it's one of those movies that, as a Best Picture winner, it's still kind of has fallen to the wayside. I don't think it's a movie that people talk about a lot. Now they do, obviously, because there's a sequel coming out with a lot of big names attached to it and everything. Mm-hmm. But I think this was a movie that was really well received when it first came out. As time went on, I think the historians kind of got to this movie and talked about the historical inaccuracies with it, which again is one of those things that Ridley Scott takes liberties with all the time. Mm-hmm. Like, you're not going to a Ridley Scott movie to see how accurate he can retell history. It's just not a thing. I think people kind of forget how phenomenal, like, Russell Crowe is a good, not often spectacular actor. And that's not the case in Gladiator. He is a spectacular actor in this. He is absolutely phenomenal. And on top of that, there's this young Joaquin Phoenix bursting onto the scene in one of cinema's greatest villains of all time.
Yeah, Joaquin Phoenix in this is so good. And he gets really like he doesn't get I don't think a lot of people realize this is where he came from, right? Like this is the movie that made Joaquin Phoenix Joaquin Phoenix. He was an unknown up until this movie. And he gets in this and all of a sudden he's doing Signs and he's doing all those movies through the 2000s and now he's an Oscar winner who probably should be a multiple Oscar winner.
Yeah.
He should have many Oscars. The back and forth between Maximus and Commodus. That's kind of the thing, right? That is Joaquin Phoenix, right? Commodus is Joaquin Phoenix, right?
I think so. Let me double check.
Anyway, whatever Joaquin Phoenix's name is, the back and forth between those two characters, the way one is loved and one is hated. You have to remember too, this was during an era when these types of movies were so popular. Braveheart comes out in 1995, wins the Oscar, is so unbelievably well received. These larger than life epics, Titanic comes out in 1997, not to the same of like the hero's journey, but this is like might be my favorite hero's journey movie. Like this movie is very simple at its core. The story, a man who has everything taken from him and he gets his revenge, but it's phenomenal storytelling, phenomenal direction, phenomenal acting, and the score, man. Woo!
Yeah.
The score just gets me pumped up. I might have to listen to that before we do our Black Hawk Down podcast so I can be properly ready to battle you.
Yeah, of course. I think what it really comes down to with this movie is it's Ridley Scott firing on all cylinders. He has the exact right cast for this movie. He has a very solid script. This is one of those ones where, yes, the director's cut is out there. I think this is one of the few Ridley Scott movies people are just like, yeah, the theatrical version is the way to go.
It doesn't need it. It doesn't need a director's cut.
No, it doesn't. And I mean, I talked about it when we covered this way back when in our top 100s. Like, this is the first R-rated movie I saw in theaters. And I mean, first off, looking at this movie and thinking it was ever rated R is wild at this point.
Because there's really, it's all violence.
Yeah.
And there's not that much, honestly. Like, there's a couple of, you know what it is? It's those moments in like the beginning and stuff where it's like, man gets throat slit brutally. You know, I mean, R-rated, you have to think in America, it's going to come down to mostly violence. So
for sure. But I mean, in the end, like, this is a very classic tale. I mean, upon you talking about the premise of the movie, I realized this is just the Count of Monte Cristo.
It's all it is.
And you know what? Maybe that's just what Ridley Scott does best, is he takes these classic stories and just changes when they take place.
You know what it is too? It's like with this one, yeah, it's a basic story. It's a very basic telling of the story, whatever. But it's so entertaining. It's so, and the thing is, you know that you're in the hands of a very talented professional as you're watching this movie.
Yes.
Right? It's so entertaining. And it's not like you're sitting there going, oh God, like, why is he going for every cliche? Why is it so corny? Why is this just a cheese fest? No, it's great the whole time. It's great. So in terms of revenge movies, yeah, top tier. What did I end up ranking this in my, because when we talked about it the first time, it was for our top 100s before we had re-ranked. What did I end up putting this at in my newest iteration of top 100, which came out at the beginning of this year? I put Gladiator at, I can't find it. Put it at 55.
It fell off.
So I think it's the 55th best movie. It fell off your list?
It did.
So you just hate Ridley Scott.
Apparently.
And I had, so actually I did this backwards.
Oh,
I have Alien at 51. I did, yeah. Oopsie.
Well, there you go.
Oh no, my whole life is a lie.
But the fact that they're within 4 on your top 100 films of all time.
Dude, they're 1A and 1B.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like, we were talking about, I was talking about with Prometheus, it's kind of that point where it goes from like good Ridley Scott to like great Ridley Scott. And then you get, those couple of movies we have in that 5 to 3 range. And then you have Gladiator and Alien. And there was no question these were going to be our 1-2. The ordering could be brought down to semantics. They're such different films from each other, but they are both just exceptionally well-made films.
You know what it is right now? I'm hyped about Gladiator 2. I'm over the fact that I just had to watch that other bullshit Alien movie.
Yeah, there you go.
Which was okay. It wasn't bullshit. It was okay. Anyway.
All
right. Well, thank you all for listening. Like this video. Subscribe to the channel. Next podcast that John and I are going to be doing is going to be best Christmas movie since 2000. Is that what we decided?
No, we said 1990, so it just encompassed our lifespans.
Got it. So best Christmas movie since 1990 will be what we're doing on December 2nd. And then we will be doing the best movies released on Christmas Day on December 16th. So those are the next 2 things we have coming out. We will not be doing a podcast December 30th. So we have 2 more left for the rest of the year. And then we can start over in January. But thank you all so much for listening. Like this video, subscribe to the channel. Black Hawk Down podcast coming out tomorrow. Matchstick Men podcast coming out on the 26th. So if you want to become a patron, patreon.com/specialist. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.